I'm Stefan Baumann. I would like to invite you on a special journey to discover the splendor, encounter the grandeur, feel the excitement. Come along with me as we experience the thrill of painting outdoors. A 3-day journey that will change your art forever. In one of America's most stunning locations, Mount Shasta. Everything you need to know is on our website, www.stefanbaumann.com. So today what we're talking about is painting trees. If we go outdoors to paint, and some of my most intimate paintings that I can remember doing have been just studies of trees. And learning how to do studies of trees, somebody here in the class said we wanted to kind of like bundle lights and shadows and so who was that last week? Who was responsible for this?
I think I asked about it.
Yeah, like masses, negative and positive masses, okay. So when you look at trees, you have trees that have no holes in them whatsoever. We call them bird holes. But when you look at it, it's like a solid wall. We look at other trees that have a lot of negative spaces, a lot of openings for birds to fly through. For the most part, trees do kind of fill up a large area in a painting. And when you're doing plein air painting, there are times when you paint what you see and you put them in, and there are times they're better off left out. A lot of times trees are altered and changed to help form the composition because they're the biggest things that you can change around. And just because you have a tree in your painting doesn't mean you have to put it in there. Likewise, if you're doing a painting and it calls for a tree, chances are if you just kind of turn around, you'll see a tree that might work that you can pull into your painting. Now, a lot of the early plein air painters, when they would go out to paint outdoors, they didn't necessarily have perfect compositions. In fact, nature is a really poor source for putting together compositions. So it does good to try to form a composition using trees, and trees are a nice vertical to put into a painting. There are certain things about trees, putting them into a painting, that you have to watch out for. One, you never want a tree to go from the bottom of the painting into your painting. So you don't want to have the trunk start from the bottom outside of the picture and go in. And the reason for that is because if you're actually out there painting outdoors and you have a tree that's actually doing that, you will actually find yourself walking further back so that that tree is actually part of your painting. In fact, a lot of times I can tell whether or not somebody's painted a painting on location of just how they work their trees. Oftentimes when they're working from photographs, they kind of duplicate the thing that you can get away with photography that you can't in painting. So a big no-no is to have a tree coming up into your painting from a frame. Okay, and then what that does is that it cuts that space there and creates a separate space alongside. So that's not a very good thing. And like I said, it's very natural for us to step back from an object and have that included. And that's usually a natural response. It's the same way as we don't have things hanging from the outside of the picture in. So you notice a lot of photographs, they'll have like trees that are hanging down in the front and there's no trunk. Okay? In a photograph, you can get away with that because somehow we just think that's a right, and it's illegal, as far as I know, to actually climb into trees and cut down limbs in the national parks. So I think that's a big no-no. Although I think a lot of the national parks need to prune. They do need to prune. They're getting a little kind of crazy. So anyway, you don't have that. So you can have a tree that starts off in the scene, and you can have it go out. So your tree can start within the painting and go out. And the thing is, if it feels like it wants to go out, then take it out. Nothing worse than an up-to tree where you just kind of go, oh, I'm getting to the top, I get smaller, I'm not going to touch the edge. No. That's odd too, that feels odd. So if you're going to have a tree that feels like it wants to go out, go out. And oftentimes the sense of the place is off kilter. If you're standing somewhere, trees are so large, so big, especially when we're amongst them, that oftentimes we only see the trunks of them. And to shrink something down to fit into a scene and have the rest of the trees fit with that sometimes doesn't make it look like the proportions are correct. So sometimes you have to think about these large masses coming in front or leave them out. Sometimes you'll have an area that's kind of blank and calls for a tree, so just pull a tree over from somewhere else and put it into your painting. Now remember, when we're outdoors painting, we're there to compose a painting. We're not there to copy it like a Xerox machine. So you don't want to have to necessarily rely on what's in front of you, although that's what a lot of people suggest to do. You don't want to copy that if it's going to be a bad composition and you need something balanced out. Pull something in. The whole beautiful thing about plein air painting is that if you need a rock, you can just look over here and pull a rock in and put it into your painting. So you have those objects to help compose a picture. At the end, nobody's going to be standing there next to you going, oh, that tree isn't in your viewpoint, you know. So a lot of times if I paint the Grand Canyon, I'll have these awesome rocks, but I want to have some of those wonderful juniper trees. And I'll just pull one over and put it where it should be. Like I said, nature's not very good at making good compositions, but I'm better at it. So I move a tree in to where I want it, but then I don't just take the tree as it comes. And this is the beauty of doing this exercise, is that if you practice juniper trees, you know what a quintessential juniper tree looks like. And so when you're painting a juniper tree, you can twist it and turn it and put the foliage in such a way, working with lights and darks and patterns, to not only have the quintessential juniper tree, but to have it shaped in a way that is perfect for you. Because remember, we all want eye magnets, and so a tree trunk can bend and bring a beautiful eye magnet where her leaves are at, you know, at the end of the branches, and those clusters out at the end, those are your patterns. And those patterns, although in a tree oftentimes will look very clunky, as an artist you kind of arrange it so it's like arranging furniture in a house. Kind of light ones at the edge, heavier ones in the middle, lighter. So if you have a real clunky tree with a real clunky branch out the end, you don't just paint that. You find the quintessential one and you paint it that way. So consequently, you want to go and study these things. So when you go outdoors to paint, oftentimes if you go to the Grand Canyon, maybe it would behoove you, before you actually jump in and do a painting, is to start doing some pencil drawings of trees. See how the branches form. If you put in a pine bough onto a juniper tree, it's going to look a little odd. And oftentimes when I see people doing juniper trees in the Grand Canyon, they have these wonderful little swirly branches that, you know, in the first windstorm would snap off in the desert, especially with snow on them. So you really kind of have to capture that. Trees really tell a lot about the location that you're at. Not only because of species, those species are there because that is what would be growing in that particular place. So you wouldn't have a juniper tree, let's say, down here in a field with a bunch of cattle. Right? Usually have them someplace where it's a little bit more challenging for them to grow. So the species help kind of tell a story. But the actual shapes. Oftentimes I'll see people that will actually paint a tree that if it snowed, those branches would fall. And so you have to kind of keep in mind, you know, the width, the height, the kind of tree. The higher the elevation, the smaller the tree, the more rugged the tree is on a windy side. Some things that you might not notice that I actually learned from somebody who cuts down trees. If you look at a pine tree, the one side of the pine tree will be fuller than the other side. So pine trees are not like this. Pine trees grow like this. And this where there's more limbs. And if you're cutting down trees, it's good to know this, to see which side of the tree has more limbs, because that's the heavier side, right? That's usually the side that hits the sun more. But you never notice that when you looked at trees. So you don't really have pine trees that are like perfect like this. So if you're facing a direction, you can actually tell which way is north and south by just how much foliage you have on one side of the tree or the other. But you wouldn't even notice that because we kind of look through trees. We kind of just assume what we're looking at. So artists just assume when they paint them. Also, what's really important is our horizon line to where we are with trees. So as we look at a tree, and this is what we were talking about last week, is that when you look at a tree, this is where your horizon line is, this is where your eyes are. And it's amazing. I can ask artists who've been painting for years, where's the horizon line? And they go, where the sky meets the mountain. And I go, but what if you're in a living room where there's no sky? And they go, exactly. The horizon line is where your eyes are. If you kneel, your horizon line is lower. When you're looking at trees, a big common mistake is that you paint a tree just as if it were just like a Christmas tree, and you plot it there and you plot it there. Same thing, but actually the higher the tree is, the more you look underneath it. And the branches that you look at up towards the top of the tree, you're actually looking underneath the tree. The branches that you're looking at go straight at you, and any of the branches that are below you, like you have with a Christmas tree or a pine tree, you're looking at the top of the branches. And so when you're painting trees, you need to ask yourself, am I looking at the top of the branch, the middle of the branch, or the underneath part of the branch? And it's amazing how people mess that up. Also, when you get close to the trunk, you have perspective. Now, as things get further away from you, they get smaller. But there's a weirdness that happens because trees get smaller too as they get away from you. Okay, so there's like a double amount. Not only do the trees get smaller as they get away from you, but because the way that you're looking at it, the perspective is even pushed even further. So it depends on where you are in relationship to that tree. So there's a lot of things to know about that. If I ask people, how does an oak tree limb attach itself to its trunk? Most people never pay attention to that. How does a pine tree attach to the trunk? How do limbs attach themselves to a pine tree? What's the difference between a pine tree and a fir tree? And how do those limbs attach? There's a lot of things that you have to keep in mind. Aspen trees, you know? At what point do aspen trees look like the limbs are coming more straight out, and what point do they look more at an angle? And the thing is, when you're looking at branches, you have to get that every branch that you see is affected by seasons. So if I were a tree and I were to grow a branch, that would be one season, right? And then winter would come. And then spring comes again, I get to grow again, and then this branch out here now goes this way. And so now you have a branch this way and then this way. And oftentimes that branch will go completely a different direction. And oftentimes if the branch is coming out, the highlight's in here, but when the limb goes to a different direction like this, there might not be any highlight on this. And I can't tell you how many paintings I see where everybody just highlights the branch all the way up. But every angle of the tree is going to accept light differently. And you'll have some limbs that actually have no light on them whatsoever. And you have some limbs that actually have reflective light, which causes the limb to almost look like it disappears, because the light that's on the limb is actually a blue light coming from the sky. And so you'll actually have areas of the limbs that almost disappear. And so you have these limbs that are light, shadow, depending on what direction. And then some of them that kind of disappear because they have reflective light. And one of the students said, well, how do you do a tree limb that comes out at you? And it's the same ways. If it comes out at you, you might have a highlight in here, but this would be in shadow, and then another highlight out in front. And also the perspective. Remember, as things get further away from you, they get smaller. So when we're looking at a tree and going this way, but if a limb's coming at you, the limb's getting smaller, but the thing is it's getting bigger because it's coming at you. The only way you can get that three-dimensional limb like that is to study it. So how do I do that? You have to play around, and that's something you would do on paper. How do I make a tree limb come out at you? Most people who paint trees just paint them like this, all the way up like a ladder. But if you notice, there's a lot of stuff in the back of a tree and a lot of stuff in the front of the tree. And how the foliage works its way in front and in back make the tree more three-dimensional. But you got to pay attention to where that happens, and then pay attention to the negative and positive shapes, because it's all about how you arrange these natural shapes that make the tree interesting. And you might have an ugly tree in front of you. An ugly tree is a tree that's just one solid nothing, just a bunch of limbs going up, and you might look over and say, wow, there's some air in this tree over here. There's more bird holes. I can see the trunk. And there's this feeling of the trunk coming through, silhouetting sometimes to sky as it goes through. Now if you see sky holes in there, the sky holes that are in there are usually 1 to 2 values darker than the sky itself. So oftentimes plein air painters will actually put the bird holes or the holes in the tree after they've painted the sky. And oftentimes on wet paint, because the sheer act of taking the sky color and putting that color onto the wet color of the tree will darken that blue to give it those kind of holes. If it looks like your tree has a bunch of white doves all over it, your sky holes are too light. And then if you put in a sky hole in there, chances are you've got a couple branches showing through it. So you're going to have to learn how to paint sky holes that actually have branches in them. You're going to leave the branch in there and paint this space around the branch with sky holes. A painting that looks really amateurish is a tree on top of a sky, like Rob Ross does. So if you paint your sky and then you paint your tree, it will look really fake. If you paint your tree first and then your sky, and you put in your sky holes and the silhouette of your trunk, and then the silhouette of your branches, and then the holes around your foliage, they'll have a more realistic effect. But look at all this stuff based around trees. Then you got to worry about the trees around the tree. Every branch that sticks out has a cast shadow, and a cast shadow on the tree next to it. And so oftentimes you'll see areas of light hitting the tree, but not like one solid thing. It's actually going to hit and miss. So the light coming onto the tree is hit and miss, because up here where the foliage is, there's going to be a shadow underneath. If the foliage comes out like this, there's going to be a shadow underneath. So that's going to be dark, and then you're going to have light again. And then you have a branch coming here that's going to cast another shadow across the tree. So your tree is going to have different lights and shadows based on the branches that are around it and based on the trees that are around those. Some of your trees sit all in shadow because they're completely surrounded by other trees.
So what have I learned? Don't try to paint a tree.
Don't paint trees. So, we talked about Shishkin. And so, some of your homework assignments, go look up Shishkin, who's a Russian painter. And, if you want to learn how to paint trees, you should see how people paint trees, and Shishkin would be one. Rob Ross is not somebody you want to look at to learn how to paint trees. But Shishkin is a Russian painter, and he painted trees and forests and things like nobody's business. But he did studies and studies and studies. So, just the study of trees is a valuable study in its own. And just the study of trees might actually make you think, maybe I'm not cut out to be a plein air painter. Because you have all that and everything else. So what we'll do is we'll discuss rocks on another date. But right now I think that doing trees is an interesting thing. Now, if you study trees from a photograph, you're not going to be able to get a really good result. Painting from life outdoors, but you don't need to necessarily even paint them. If you just go out with a pencil and paper, you'll be able to do that. So when people are like going, well, I'm going to go out and do some plein air painting, you know, what should I paint? I go, just find a tree, sit in a meadow, cross your legs on the ground, and just draw what's in front of you and try to really capture what's there. You will be amazed. Yeah, and the thing is, if you're putting bird holes in a tree or holes in a tree and you have trees behind there, those holes that are in the tree are not sky holes. Now they're colors of trees that are behind there. And if you don't get your temperature and you don't get your values correct, you can get really messed up. So one of the best things you could possibly be doing is studying trees. And you don't need to go very far to do that. For some of you could just go out into your backyard and do that. And don't take trees for granted, because I guarantee you, if you mess up your trees with a capital F, your painting is not going to look good, no matter how good you are at plein air painting. If you don't think of all these things, and even while I'm sitting here thinking about what I think about when I'm out there painting outdoors on trees, I go, how in the hell do I do that? Because you only have a couple of hours and then the whole painting, and then on top of it you got to pee. So trees are not an easy thing, and then people get really upset. So my student this morning, she went down to Washington, and she lives in, I don't know, Washington, D.C. She must be close, because she went down to the place where all the cherry blossom trees are blossoming, and so they're all blossoming. Wow. And she went out there to paint the cherry blossoms, and then I get this note from her saying it sucks, and I'm like going... Well, kind of, but the thing is, it's like, but the thing is, though, she's not somebody who spent a lot of times going outdoors, so she was cold and she had to pee and she had things that she had to do. I don't know what it is, but the thing is, when you first go out there, it's not going to be good and fun. Even if you're a really good painter, to go outdoors and paint is a different thing. It's hard, and that's why they call it like the new golf. You know, because you rarely get. And I told her, I said, you know, I painted and taught for 10 years till I finally got my hole-in-one. And when you get your hole-in-one, you know it. You know when you get your hole-in-one, you go, ah. It will be a moment in time that you actually will feel like you want to buy dinner for everybody. But that took 10 years for me. Oftentimes it takes more for others. When you finally get the one, that's the beginning of when you start like knowing what it is that you're doing out there. So your first experience of plein air painting is going to be hideous. And a lot of people who come to the plein air convention are in tears. And they're inundated with all of this information, and it's great information. But the thing is, what the mind wants to do is a masterpiece. And when you're out there, you've got trees to deal with. And all of that information. Now the great thing is that everything you need is right in front of you, but you got to look for this. And practice, practice, practice. Any questions? Now keep in mind that the sun is changing. You have all of these branches doing this way.
When I started it, it was like over there. By the time I decided to move in.
Yeah, so all of a sudden you're painting, there's the highlight here, and then a few minutes later the highlight's here, that's in shadow. So it becomes really difficult. And the only way that you can actually accomplish plein air painting is to freeze frame it in your mind and then turn your back away from it.
I learned.
You learn how to do that.
Yes, you have to do what you saw.
It's sheer survival.
It stays.
It does, actually. That's why you want to work. Carlson's book on landscape painting, the last chapter, which I was surprised last year at the plein air convention where I was giving a demo. I said, how many of you have the book, Carlson's book on landscape painting? And almost everybody raised their hand because it's the Bible to plein air painting. I said, what's the last chapter? And you know, nobody knew. I gave it, there were 250 people in the room. Not one person stood up and said, it's on memorization. You'd be surprised when you look at something how you can recall it. And it's a practice, it's a skill that you have to practice. So, this is a wonderful, great start. You have highlights and shadows and constant things, but look at how beautiful all of these forms are, and in itself becomes almost an abstract. We were talking about some of the abstracts that were on the wall, but the thing is, when you base an abstract on actual natural form, the brain actually can look at it abstractly, if you can get that. And so all of this stuff, as she's working on it, if one thing's kind of out of place, something rings in her head, and she goes, oh, that branch has to be smaller as it gets further out. And then when the branch is too wiggly or noodly, it kind of says it doesn't belong here. So this is really a great check and balance. This kind of study could take you several weeks to do, and it's a lot of value to do it over several weeks. You almost have to do this. Yeah.
And then I saw the grayness in the back from the dead branches in the back there, and I didn't know how to deal with that.
Well, see, the thing is, like even here, these branches going away from you that become blurry, they're actually blurry branches. You know, because here you got to keep in mind your central focal point is usually somewhere else than the holes in the tree. And so you want to have a lot of hard and soft edges, and branches that go away from you are blurry, and also branches coming at you. So like if our depth of field is such that we're looking at the trunk of the tree, and you have a limb coming out at you, this limb that's coming out at you is going to be blurry, unless you change your eye focus. It's just like if you look at me right now, so this is I'm the tree, right? But as I'm putting this in here, and you keep looking at me, this is going to be out of focus, because it comes out at you, right? So knowing how that looks out of focus is important to paint it that way. So you have that to deal with. And as things get further away from you, because you're looking at the trunk, what goes on the other direction is also out of focus. So these softer edges back here is actually something that happens when you look at there. And then also as they go further out, they might have some reflective light from the sky, and they might even disappear at places. Those little tiny branches that you see in the distance almost disappear because they're lit up with blue lights. So it's really crazy.
Because I read Carlson's book in the memory. He said one, research trees close to your house. So I walked around, found my trees, and every time I wanted to paint a tree, I would walk down my road and go study it, come back, paint. Or walk down the road and study it. So a lot of it is from memory.
Yeah. Now see, if we look at these trees here, they're like this. What I'm missing is a branch that kind of comes like this.
It's a dead manzanita.
Yeah.
So most of the limbs got chopped off, but I just kind of like it.
And like you said, when you start rereading Carlson's book, when you know a little bit more about painting, it's an easier read.
It is.
Because otherwise it's really, really hard to read when
It
you're...
is very difficult. And like Carlson, he says, he relates trees to tree men, because he said they're out there, they all have their own personalities, and
Every
they're
tree.
more human than
Yeah.
humans.
Yeah. And the thing is, if you duplicate a tree twice, it's obvious.
It's what?
Obvious.
Oh.
Yeah. You want to make sure that they all have different degrees of friends. Usually one or two friends that are kind of clustered, and then the ones they don't like so much are a little further away. And then they have their in-laws, which are even further away.
He says trees respect each other.
They do. They do absolutely respect each other, and that's the truth. They'll grow in a certain relationship to itself before, and I bet you if you really mathematically figured it out, a lot of it would have to do with the golden mean, the natural rhythm of nature. And even the limbs come up as a golden mean too. So they all have their own personality, they all respect each other, they all have a mathematical equation that's equal. The branches down below are further apart from each other than the ones towards the top. And if you put a golden mean on there and do the proportions on there, you'll see the proportions are very similar to what you see in a Nautilus shell. Smaller spaces on the top, and as you go down to the base, they get further apart. If you'd like to take your painting to the next level, regardless at whatever level you are, please feel free to contact me personally at 415-606-9074. Join us on our website, thegrandview.org, and get more information about our show. There you can download our free book, Everything You Need to Know About Outdoor Painting, along with a free diagram of today's subject.